All right, well, it is 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and kick things off with a little housekeeping items. First off, I want to thank you all for coming and joining us virtually today. I would also thank those that provided any feedback through our evaluation process last week. We really appreciated that. And we're still working on perfecting on the technology side of things. We have improved audio quality over last week when it comes to the field recording, so hope you enjoy that here in just a minute. We're still figuring things out, so please bear with us as we do so. We do want to continue offering these virtual field days with a field component like this video, because being in the field allows the speaker to cover or address additional items that they may not remember or think of when they're looking at still images, like in a PowerPoint, and then just trying to describe them. So we're going to continue to be using field recorded footage for these events. I also want to point out that there is a brief handout available on our website. That's iowalearningfarms.org on the events page. I'm posting it here in the chat window too, so you can copy and paste that link to get to that 2-page handout. It just provides a little bit of more information based on what Wade's saying, so you can help follow along as we move between these 4 fields. I am Liz Jugums. I'm the Conservation and Cover Crop Outreach Specialist with the Iowa Learning Farms. We were established in 2004, and our mission is to build a culture of conservation by working with farmers, researchers, to implement practices like cover crops and a few others that Wade's going to discuss that improve water quality, soil health, while remaining profitable. Our partners include the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, Iowa Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, US EPA Section 319, Conservation Districts of Iowa, Iowa Farm Bureau, Practical Farmers of Iowa, GrowMark, Iowa Agriculture Water Alliance, Iowa Corn, and this series is also being brought to you by the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. So without their partnership, this would not be possible, so I do want to give them a thank you. And another quick housekeeping, we do ask that you remain on mute during the video portion of the event, but then we do welcome you to unmute to ask your questions of Wade. We encourage this discussion and dialogue amongst those that are here. We will be doing an evaluation just like we did last week, so we will be sending that out later this afternoon. It's a quick link to fill it out, give us some feedback as we work to improve these events. And today we're going to be featuring Wade Dooley. He's a farmer in Marshall County. Farming for the Future is what we've deemed this one, because he's doing some really innovative things on his farm and working towards that goal of improving water quality and soil health and remaining profitable.
Hey Liz, did you talk to him about how we're videotaping and why?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
So we are encouraging you to, again, if you're joining us a little bit in the last couple minutes, we do have a 2-page handout on our website, our events page. So if you're already in earlier, that direct link is in the chat box. If not, you can navigate there at iowalearningfarms.org. And to help us kind of get a feel for who's joining us today, I'm inviting you to click on the participants little icon that appears in your Zoom window, and that'll give you the option to vote yes or no. And if you are a farmer and or landowner, could you please click yes? I'll resubmit those instructions via the chat window.
Liz, some of your chats are just coming to me. There we go. Okay.
I see that now. Sorry about that. These should be going to everybody now. All right. So it looks like we got a few people voting, but again, if you can click on the participants and then select yes if you identify as a farmer landowner, that'll help us out. And we'll keep that open and then we'll figure that out during our next intermission. But without further ado, I'm going to be playing our first of 4 video clips introducing Wade and what he's doing on his farm.
My name's Wade Dooley. I'm the 6th generation on my family's farm, and we're standing on it right now. We've raised corn and soybeans, small grains, cow-calf beef operation. I also raised a small amount of popcorn, and I did some vegetables for a while in and out of that some years. We do custom hay and custom seeding, and I also raise the small grains for cover crop seed. We've been doing cover crops on our farm since '97. Started into it because we had ground that flooded out, put silage on it, took it off, and then wanted to have something on that ground to try and catch what leftover nutrients we had and maybe get a little grazing out of it in the fall. We've been doing that ever since then. Started flying on cover crops in 2010 after a couple experiments in '08 and '09, and that's worked really well. I've done a lot of different cover crop trials with Practical Farmers of Iowa, and it's been really interesting. I've learned all the ways what you're not supposed to do, and still trying stuff. So, all right, so the field we're on right now, some of it was taken for corn silage last fall, and the rest of it was harvested as regular grain crop. The silage ground we drilled right after silage harvest, and that's all straight rye. And behind me, this cornfield was flown on rye because it looked like even in August last year done. So we flew the rye on along with some rapeseed, and the take was all right. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty decent. And then we ran cattle on it all winter, and so they mowed it all off. So the ground that I'm standing on right now is almost black. The rye was mowed off so short. Took the herd off about a month and a half ago, and now we've got probably 4 to 6 inches of regrowth now. And so I put my cows back on it here yesterday, and they're pretty happy. So they've got about 90 acres to run on now of rye to graze. The corn stalks are pretty much played out. They took all the good stuff off of it last fall and over winter. So now they're just living on the rye, which obviously there's enough out here for the small herd I've got left now. So we're doing pretty good. We're standing pretty good on feed. One of the downsides of having an airplane fly on your seed is that you don't get perfect coverage. And the same thing with running a drill, you can't always get in the corners of the field, and so you've got to be planning for that. So off to my left, there's a couple patches on the edges of the field where the airplane shut off a little early, and so there's no cover crop there. And there's a few areas on the edges of this field I'm in where I turned the corner a little short with the drill, and so I've got nothing there. So I will have weed issues everywhere I don't have rye right now. I'll also have issues with compaction from the cattle in the areas where I don't have rye. The areas where the rye is growing, I'm not worried about compaction issues. We used to go and deep rip everything we ran cattle on in the wintertime. We deep rip it in the spring and then we plant, but we don't do that anymore because we don't need to. The rye roots do their job, and they break up all the compaction. The hard pan that we worry about is gone. And that's really been a wonderful thing to discover. It's taken several years. It didn't happen the first year, but it's taken several years of doing this every year, and it's really made a big improvement. We save fuel, we save time, and the deep ripper just sits parked in the row, so that's nice. So these spots, we'll probably just treat them like the rest of it. The area that it isn't large enough. There's not enough acres to worry about. It's just going to be a few problem areas in a much larger field, so it's not really something to be concerned about. It's just something to pay attention to.
All right. So at this time, Wade, go ahead, unmute, and we can learn a little bit more about what you're doing there around the home, and people can ask questions.
Okay. So I'm not sure what everybody is interested in learning about. Looks like there's a whole bunch of folks on this now, so could be a pretty broad range of people's interest here. Does anybody have any questions right off the start? Or you could type them into the chat box too. So one thing the video didn't mention is that we've sold off the majority of the herd now, and so we've really changed out the number of head that are on ground. Normally we'd have 75 to 80 head of cattle on those 90 acres, and they'd push it pretty hard, but now I'm down to about 18 head out there, and so it's going to get ahead of them. In fact, right now, that rye that we videoed on Tuesday has grown 2 more inches. So it's really getting up there, and it's going to get ahead of the cattle here in another probably 5 days with the rain we just got.
Hey, Wade.
Yeah.
Jackie here. So you're got a smaller herd, but what's the long-term plan when it comes to livestock? What's the goals here? Are you transitioning to a new breed, or what are you doing?
Right. So the ultimate goal is to remove all of our conventional cattle and upgrade to a grass-finished operation. And since it took 50 years to breed conventional feedlot type cattle, we're not going to spend 50 years to breed it backwards. We're just going to go and buy a new herd, but not right yet. My plan right now, or rather the plan this winter before the pandemic, was to sell the herd, use that money to pay down debt, redo all of my pastures because my paddocks are not quite set up for grass finishing. I can't move cattle fast enough. So I need to rebuild all my paddocks and get better water systems in. And then I'm going to custom graze for several years to build capital back up to be able to buy a herd.
Now, are you also with the new herd, with the new breed that you're doing, and so it can be grass fed, but are you also being sensitive to some climate change issues and the resiliency of the herd to hotter temperatures, more humidity?
Yes, absolutely. So part of the reason I want to go for grass finished animals is because I want to trend more towards a perennial system. The annual cropping systems that we have don't have a lot of flex in them for bad weather events, and we have a lot of those. And I think we'll talk further about the weather in some more video clips. But yeah, I want to trend more towards a perennial based system so that I can deal with the climate as it changes and the factors that have always played a role in our farm. I see you've got several questions here. I better answer some of them quick.
Yeah, and some of them you might be answering later in video too, so go ahead and say that if that's going to be the case.
Okay, let's see. We'll start. Allison Robertson is asking soybeans or corn this year. The field I was standing in there is going to soybeans, and we'll be working that ground only because the cattle have really torn it up and it's too rough to keep the planter in the ground. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to tear it up normally, but the cattle have worked it over pretty good, so we're going to have to smooth it out. And Lee's asking about the cover crop mix for grazing. It's all about timing. That field, I had more mixes in what was seeded on the silage ground, but none of them overwintered because they weren't supposed to. It was oats, rape, and rye that was in that, and I might have had some leftover clover seed I threw in too. But the only thing that survived through the winter is the rye, which is pretty much to be expected. And then as far as grazing mix for outside of that seeding window in the summertime, I like to throw as many plants into the mix as possible. But fall, there's just not much that makes it through the winter other than rye or winter wheat. We used to do a lot of winter wheat, but my source for that's just got too far away. The logistics weren't so handy. Whereas I can grow my rye here and I can sell it to my neighbors. Nobody wants to buy winter wheat for seed, which is ridiculous because it's just as good as rye for grazing. The cattle like it better into the spring. We got Rob Myers is about compaction. How have we handled watering to avoid compaction around a water source? So the water source for that field is actually an old hog lot. So it's got concrete all the way around the water, and so that helps a lot. And then the trails going into there are usually pretty narrow. And when you consider a 90-acre field and you've got a trail that's about a foot wide, as far as the total impact on your yield, it's just not enough to consider anymore. Otherwise, the cattle are usually so spread out across the ground. Like today, my 18 head are currently covering 20 acres of the 90. There's probably they're keeping proper social distance. They're about 30 foot apart all over, so they're not packing the ground very much. And I see Christopher Clark's asking, when do we want to plant those fields? That particular field's going to soybeans, so it won't get planted until probably mid-May, at which point the rye, I would expect it to be probably waist high. So we'll get quite a bit of grazing. From now until mid-May is effectively the peak grazing season for a cover crop like rye. Once it starts heading out, the cattle really don't like it as much, but they'll still graze on it. So we'll get quite a bit. There's actually some numbers out of Practical Farmers of Iowa where a lot of farmers went out and did biomass sampling to figure out how many pounds of forage you get based on the growth stage of the plant. I don't take that data, so I don't have it up at the top of my head. But there's a lot of resources available right now. If you go online, you can find that stuff out. Okay, what else do we have?
Unless there are more questions for this field, we'll move on to the next one.
Okie dokie.
All right.
So the field we're standing in right now is part of what I'm considering my transition ground. Not transitioning to organic, but transitioning the farm into a new phase. I talked about earlier what we've done in the past and the diverse operation we had. I'm still doing all of those things, but to a much different extent. The field we're in right now is going to be converted over into CRP for the next 10 years. And the trees that are behind me, that's the Iowa River. This is all river bottom ground that we're on right now. And when the river floods, I'd be about neck deep in water. So it used to be that we'd get a flood in the springtime and it'd be quick up, quick down, no big deal. And that happened for 40, 50 years. Wasn't a big concern because usually it would happen early enough that we didn't have any crop in the field anyway. Well, the last 10 to 15 years, the climate has changed so much that we get floods every year that are catastrophic level. Instead of a quick up and quick down and maybe you get 6 or 8 inches of water flowing across the ground, we get feet upon feet of river water cutting across our ground. And instead of being up and down in 2 days, it's up for a week or more. And so when you've got that much of an impact from river flooding, the system that you're using has to change. And I've pretty much given up trying to fight Mother Nature because there's no way I'm going to win that battle. So instead I'm going to work with Mother Nature. So this ground is going into CP23 mix, which is a wetland native grass mix. And my goal is to have tall grasses that get up growing taller than me, catching all of the sediment that flows down the river every time it floods, and I'll actually gain dirt. All my neighbors' dirt that's washing off their hillsides will end up on my farm. And I'll grow my soil faster than I possibly could have by myself. Eventually, this ground, being that it's going to be in native grasses, hopefully I can turn it over and convert it to pasture in 10 years. But we'll see how that plays out. The climate is changing, and I don't care what your politics are because they don't matter. I've watched this river go nuts so many times in the last 10 years. I don't care what the politicians say. The climate is changing and we're going to deal with it. And so this is my way of handling part of it.
All right. So Wade, when did you make that decision and how did you prepare to make that transition to CRP there in that particular field?
Well, I've been playing with different ways to deal with that ground for years and years. And one of the things that really got me thinking about it was when we had cover crops on that ground. In some spots and in other places they didn't take. We had a wet dry cycle that caught us wrong for seeding. The areas that had cover crops on them, when the river flooded, it did not scour the ground, but the areas that didn't have cover crops growing, it scoured down to the bottom of the stubble roots. And so we lost a lot of dirt there, but then it got humped up as soon as it hit the fence line into our permanent pasture ground. we started gaining dirt there. So it was, the grass was all catching all that soil. And I thought to myself, you know, this is kind of silly that I keep trying to build soil using cover crops and no-till, and here I'm getting soil just washing across the top that I could be collecting. And the best way to collect it is with things to slow the water down, and tall grasses do the best job of that. And about that point, I was doing a lot of custom seeding for customers, putting in CRP. The pollinator program had just come out, and so folks were really jumping on board with that. And so I finally made the decision last fall that it was about time I get in on this, because the average payout for CRP was starting to drop pretty dramatically. So I got signed up in time this winter so that we didn't get too much of a decrease in what we could get for a rental payout from the government. And so then that'll help pay for the seeding costs. And then I'll also make about as much in the 10 years as I would have in good crop years. And in 10 years of farming that ground, you get maybe 2 or 3 good years and about 5 decent years. And then there's some years in there that are just absolutely terrible. And so CRP is a flat rate every single year. And I've never had that. I've never gotten paid the same every year on that ground. So that'll be a pleasant experience, I hope, anyway.
So Wade, did they kind of, in coming up with the seeding mix, did take into account that might be a fairly wet environment with thinking of what native species?
So we haven't actually settled on the exact mix yet.
Okay.
Right next to the river, and then that kind of fades out in waves into just jet black gumbo, and then some lighter, siltier, sandier soils. And so in a 70-acre field, I've got probably 15 different distinct growing habitats as far as soils go, even though they're not reflected in the soil map data. But it's very variable throughout that ground. And so the mix is going to have to be pretty diverse to be able to make sure I've got something that survives on every one of the soil types and with every one of the water considerations, because our water table down there right now, the river's not very high. Our water table is probably 4 feet from the surface. And so when we start getting a lot of spring rains, we haven't gotten very many yet, but when we start getting spring rains, that water table will rise up to be within inches of the soil surface, even if the river doesn't flood. So yeah, wet tolerant plants are absolutely at the top of the list. Any other questions? You can put it in the chat box too if you don't want to speak up, and I can go through them.
Folks are welcome to unmute themselves and speak up if they want.
Wade, I have a question about grazing and water. I have a neighbor who runs quite a few ewes and claims that he's got a grass mix figured out that doesn't require much water for the ewes out on that grazing area. Can you do something like that with cattle where the grass mix or whatever they're grazing really gives them enough water so you don't need to haul water, take water to them, or offer water?
Well, I'm not sure about picking out species for that, but a lot of times a really good diverse pasture is going to be able to collect a lot of dew in the morning.
Okay.
And so that can supply quite a lot of the water needs for the animals. And then also, if you've got decent shade or the animals don't get hot,
Right.
That's a major help. If they don't get hot in the middle of the summertime, then you're not going to use near as much water or need as much water access.
Right.
And so the more diverse, the taller, the deeper the pasture, usually the cooler it is.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Liz, let's show the next video.
All right.
All right, so the field I'm standing in now is my rye for grain field. So this was seeded after soybean harvest, which was later than I wanted it to be. I think it was right around the 29th or 30th of October. Normally I want to get rye in the ground for grain harvest way earlier than that, but this last fall nothing dried down fast, so I was not alone in a delayed harvest and then a delayed seeding. But the rye's looking pretty good right now. The stand's acceptable. It's not fantastic, but it'll still grow a pretty good yield. I'm hoping on this ground to get somewhere, 45, 50 bushel rye should do pretty good, assuming we continue having warm weather. Last spring's weather was not conducive for rye growth for seed, and a lot of guys I knew didn't get very good yields. My yields were off by 20% probably. So I'm hoping this spring, being that it's already warm, I get lucky and get the yields that I'm aiming for. So the rye that comes off of this field is all for cover crop seed. So I've got an application in right now with the Iowa Crop Improvement Association to get this as certified seed. They're usually backlogged, so I don't know when I'll hear from them, but hopefully I can get this certified, and that way it'll be a higher quality product to sell to customers. So this ground is one of our better producing fields. It's really good high quality Tama soils, and normally it'll put out 220 to 230 bushel corn, dry corn for yield. And I've got it in rye, and I'll make more net profit on the rye than I will on corn or soybeans this year. And if anybody's been watching the crop markets lately, you know almost anything makes more money than corn and soybeans this year. So it's not that hard. But even in good years, my cover crop seed costs me less to produce, and I can sell it for just as much or more than I can my soybeans. And it allows me then to come in the summer with different kinds of cover crop mixes, or I could frost seed clover in. I've done both many times in the past. I've been raising small grains for cover crop seed since 2015 or thereabouts. And so I've been playing around with it quite a bit, trying to get better at growing small grains. It's something that everybody in this area grew 50 years ago, but then they went away from it due to market factors and the fact that crop insurance pays better for corn and beans. I see the future to be more diverse for crops, for farmers to grow. We have the most productive soils in the world. We only grow two things, and that's dumb. So it's ridiculous that we can't grow anything else. And it's not that we can't, really. It's just that we don't. Everybody makes excuses, and they always boil down to, oh, well, the numbers don't allow for it. But if you sit down and you crunch your numbers, there's no good reason to raise corn or soybeans. If you sit down and figure out your time, your effort, and the investment in your equipment, you could grow anything and still make as much or more than corn and soybeans. So it's in our heads, not in our pocketbooks, that makes the decision. And so that's part of the transition that I'm making on our farm, is to stop being married to two crops and to go after the things that actually are going to make enough profit that I can live comfortably. Because we shouldn't be fighting every year just to break even. So I love it when I hear somebody say that we're feeding the world, because I have never seen anyone sit down to a bowl of number 2 yellow corn and just chow down on it. And that's what we grow here. We don't grow food. You don't eat the corn coming out of the big fields. That's feedstock for an industrial system that is incredibly complex and very diverse in all the products that we can make out of corn. But corn itself that we grow now isn't food. It becomes products used in food. That's not the same thing. The soybeans we grow isn't for human consumption directly. It's used in a complex process for lots of different products, some of them used for food. But the soybeans themselves are not direct human food. They could be, but they aren't. So we aren't feeding the world. So why even bother saying that? We can grow anything. We can actually grow real food. I could take this rye, mill it, and I could have rye flour directly. But I'm going to sell it for cover crop seed because it's worth more. Food grade is good for pricing, but seed price is better. So the money plays out better on that. So yeah, so some of the stuff I'm saying is kind of inflammatory. but that's just who I am. I have had lots of conversations with my folks. This is a family farm. I am the 6th generation on it. So I have a lot of history going behind me and a lot of expectations and hopes and dreams of those before. And I'd like someone to be after me to take up the reins also. And so my argument has always been that I am not farming this just for me. I am farming for the next generation and the one after, as my parents did for me and the one after me. So my folks, they back me. They don't necessarily understand everything I'm doing or why, but neither do I, so it's all right. The neighbors watch and wait. I've got a lot of neighbors doing cover crops, and then I have other neighbors that believe that tillage is the only way to be a good steward of the land. And it's difficult to convince somebody else that what you're doing is the right thing to do if they don't see you succeeding at it every single time. And so we've been doing it long enough. With the cover crops, we've pretty well got the ones that are convinced that those work well. Raising small grains, I've had a few neighbors do small grains in the past because I was doing it, and they keep talking about wanting to get back in to do a little bit here and a little bit there. So we'll see how that plays out. The crop markets the way they are right now might encourage them to try something different, just simply because nothing makes money. So if you're going to lose money over here, why not try something new and lose money there? Or make money there, you don't know. So it's a challenge always to buck the trend or to step outside the paradigm, but it's time.
Looks like there was one that came through the chat box in regards to variety that you're using.
Yeah. Lee, the variety of rye, I've grown multiple named varieties in the past. And so it really boils down to what your goals are for that rye crop. Most of the ones I've grown are a heavy yielding grain type rye. And so I've done Hazlitt and Danko. And the one I've got right now in that field is Dillon, which is a brand new variety out of North Dakota. And I'm excited to see what it can do because it's supposed to be a really good performer as far as growth characteristics and yield. So it's exciting. But if you want to do something that's more of a forage type, say you want to run cattle on it and have it really tiller a lot, or you want to do something that's going to have a lot of biomass or a lot of tonnage, you want to do a forage type like Elbon. And I've raised Elbon before, and it really is noticeably different as a plant goes between the forage type rye and the grain type rye. But the forage type, the seed is smaller and it's not as vigorous. So a lot of folks don't like it because of that. So there's different factors you have to consider, and then decide also price. Elbon rye usually yields a little bit less, and so the seed cost is higher, but you get more seeds per pound. So it depends on your purpose. What else do we have? Are we marketing the cereal rye through partners? No. Right now, I have been marketing all of my rye off my farm to my neighbors and folks that know me. So it is as grassroots, as it gets. So I have thought about trying to get a little more organized with that, but at this point, I haven't gotten that far yet.
All right, I know, Chris, if you wanted to unmute yourself for a second, you mentioned something you wanted to address about livestock water access.
Yeah, thank you. So I am a beef specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. And I just wanted to chime in on that question about watering. I always recommend that we have access to fresh, clean water. I think water access is really critical, and it's pretty unlikely that the forage can provide enough moisture. Definitely that forage will be nice and wet in the spring. You know, it might even be 80–85% moisture. So they might not drink a lot of water during that time, but certainly as we get deeper into the summer, the plant moisture actually goes down. We tend to have more heat stress, especially if you don't have access to shade, especially if the cattle are black. Mature cattle can drink, 20, 30 gallon of water on a hot day. So it's really important to have that access, in my opinion.
All right, Wade, it looks like you got another question that came in.
Yep. So yeah, ND Dillon. So the North Dakota variety that I've got out there right now, that is actually, we went up and my folks went up and got it for me. It's registered seed. So I have to get it certified in order to be able to sell it. So that is a fact. So that's why I'm waiting on the Crop Improvement Association. But they don't have that much for staff. And since the pandemic's hit, I have a feeling they're having problems getting all their stuff done. So. And I'll agree that the water access, I didn't intend to mean that grass is going to supply all the water that the animals need. No, that was not my intention to make it sound like that. Just that it can help with some of the needs, but it's definitely not going to fulfill all the needs ever.
Any other questions or comments about raising rye for seed or what Wade mentioned in that portion? All right, on to the final field.
All right, so this field was my rye field last year. And so after harvest, I came in and drilled in an extremely diverse cover crop seed mix in August. And so what's growing now is what an acre cover of rye itself, along with all of the other stuff I planted out here. The mix I got, I don't even know what all was in it. There was at least 20 to 30 species. I could identify maybe 10 to 15 of them. Here's some things that survived. We've got purple top turnip, that's a radish, and he's just getting ready to start blooming. So we'll have lots of little flowers out here pretty soon for the bumblebees. And here's another turnip that looks like he probably started germinating this spring. So some of the seed was a little harder and didn't grow. But there's vetch, there's all kinds of stuff out here. And the more diverse the cover crop mix, the faster the soil regenerates and the better this ground will do for a crop in the next couple of years. So I'm going to see results from 1 year of a highly diverse cover crop mix. I'm going to see the results of that for the next probably 5 years on this ground. And this ground really needed some help. Other farms of ours really produce really good corn and soybean yields. This particular area does not, because it was depleted before we used it. And we did what we could to bring it back, but honestly the best thing to make soil become as productive as we'd like it to be is to put on cover crops and treat it like Mother Nature wants to, not work it to death, not let it wash down. So one of the fun things about growing diverse cover crop mixes, especially ones that you start in late summer, is you actually get to eat sometimes some of your cover crops. And so one of the nice things with raising turnips or radishes is in the fall they're actually sweeter than in the spring, because they're storing all of these sugars to be able to withstand all those frosts and freezes. And so they get super, super sweet. And they're delicious. I don't like spring raised turnips. I never liked turnips. But I've been eating turnips all winter long that I come out to this field and just pick whatever looks good. And it's been pretty kind of neat. And I got a couple neighbors that they come out and they'll pick turnips and radishes and whatever else. So don't think of cover crops as just something to leave out there for all the critters to get at. You can eat them too. So given the fact we do a lot of planting green or planting into heavy, heavy residue, we use a no-till white planter. It's an older model, but it's just fine for this application. We didn't modify the planter much at all. It's got heavy-duty down pressure springs, so we can get 300 pounds of down pressure if we need it. Usually we don't. After the second year of cover crops, I don't use that highest setting anymore. But we do have modified press wheels at the back to get the trench to close. And we put on spiked, what are they called? Copperheads make them, the furrow closers, and I went cheap, and I only did one side of a two-sided unit, and it works great. Works good in tilled ground, works good in our no-till, and the ultimate goal being we want to make sure that seed trench gets closed, because I had a mistake several years ago where we didn't get the seed trench closed, and then we came in and sprayed the burn down on the standing rye, and the herbicide damaged the seedlings in the soybean crop because I didn't have the trench closed, so it had direct contact to the seed. So it's a mistake that I learned very quickly and never made again. So one of the beautiful things about cover crops is that on ground that's hilly or rolling, we don't lose any more soil. The water coming off of this field is clean. It's clear, it's beautiful. I'm not losing any more topsoil than we already have. Iowa started out with what, 8 feet of black dirt? And I have neighbors that farm clay hillsides now. Where did it all go? It all went down to the bottom and away. And we need to stop exporting our greatest commodity, which is our soil. And so I'm doing everything I can to keep the soil I've got and to build more. All of this material behind me, all of this residue, is building my organic matter, and it's storing carbon. And as long as I don't come in and tear it all up and ruin what I just did, I'm gaining ground and I'm helping the environment as a whole. And that's something we all need to remember, that we're not the only ones that are on this ground, and we're not the only ones that are affected by what we do on our farms.
So it looks like quite a few came in during that time. So if you want to address those, and again, feel free to unmute and ask questions as well.
All right, so let's see. The planter for seeding rye, I've got a 30-foot Landau grain drill, and it is set up at 7.5-inch spacing. So it's about as narrow a planting as I can get. It does a really good job. It's a box drill, so it's a little older fashioned than some. I'd love to have an air seeder, but they are double the cost. So unless somebody's got 200,000, they'd love to just hand me, I think I'll hold off on that for a bit. But I really want an air seeder because I'd be able to be a lot faster. The radishes and turnips did overwinter. Normally, I would expect the radishes and turnips to freeze off and turn to mush by March. But because we had such a thick stand of cover crops out there, we had so many species, and it did such a great job in the fall, it made a microclimate, and a bunch of stuff overwintered that I would not have expected it to. I've got peas out there, and peas should have froze off, and they're 12 inches tall now. So they're quite happy and growing. So it's not something I really expected to see, but I'm glad to see it because it meant that the soil biology was kept active. So that's a big deal for me. I want that soil biology. I want those microbes working all the time. And the more food we've got for them, the more growing roots we have in the ground, the more microbial activity we have. And so the more organic matter we build, the better water infiltration we have, the better water holding capacity we have, so that when we get a big rain, it soaks in and it stays in the ground instead of washing off the top and hitting the waterways fast. So all of it plays together really well. Nutrient levels and composition. So my cover crops that I've got out there right now, that last field is the one with the hyper diverse mix. That one has legumes and brassicas and grasses all thrown in together. And so each one has its own little special thing it does to change how the soil operates. Microbes feed on different plant roots. So each one has their own thing they do. And I don't understand all of the science behind all of this. This is where the folks at Iowa State might chime in a little bit. But effectively, what we're trying to do is improve what used to be called soil tilth, and now I'm calling soil health, the aggregate stability, the macropore space, and all of the other things that are affected by those, the water infiltration, water holding capacity, the organic matter and changing our cation exchange capacity, opening up more nutrients to be available to the plants to absorb rather than just something that can be tested. So let's see what else we got. Are we planning to plant the field? Yes, actually, it just got its burn down. That last field just got sprayed yesterday. And so that will go to soybeans here pretty soon in the next, hopefully, 2 weeks. So normally we'd plant green, but because of all those legumes in there, the herbicide program doesn't play well with soybeans. So we have to spray ahead of time.
Hey, Wade, this is Jackie. How many acres then of corn and soybeans will you have this year?
So my own acres, I have reduced down to, I've cut 80% of my total crop acres. So I'm down to about 35 acres of actual row crop, and then the 80 acres of grain rye, and then a bunch of hay ground and pasture. So it's a big shift for me. The field we were just on, my dad's going to farm this year. And so it'll still be in the family, but it's his operation, not mine, that's going to be getting the benefit. Let's see, Larry's asking about tillage. So the reason we use tillage, and we only use it in specific instances, the only place we're using tillage this year is where we ran the cattle in the winter and early spring, and they have thoroughly pockmarked the ground. It's too rough to run the planter across and actually get the seed to go in the ground. So we've got to do tillage to smooth the ground out. And when we're doing that, we'll just go ahead and use that tillage as our termination pass. So it'll save us on herbicide in that field. But we only do that on where we're running the cattle. Otherwise, everything else is no-till. And so I'm hoping in the future to reduce to the point where we have everything no-till and zero tillage, except in unique instances like somebody drove through in the when it was wet and made ruts, and then we'll have to fill the ruts in. But other than that, we don't want to use tillage if we don't have to. Let's see, what else do we have? So the differences of seed reacting in different drills and planting problems. So we've had, we've had a lot of interesting experiences as a cover crop seeder and as a custom drill operator. I've experienced an awful lot of other people's ideas of clean seed, and have learned from those experiences, we'll say. I refuse to use anybody else's bin run seed ever in my drill again. I had 90 bushels of supposedly clean oats from the neighbor I was drilling, and it took me 4 days to get the ground seeded because the drill kept plugging and I kept having to fight it. And it turns out that they had never cleaned their seed. They just thought it was clean enough when they dumped it out of the combine. So I highly recommend, if you're going to use anybody else's seed, make sure it's actually cleaned, or use a broadcaster because it doesn't have to be clean then. Let's see, what else do we have?
And you can keep your questions coming in, but I'm just going to share this here. If you are getting a CCA continuing education unit, to email me, ejukums@iastate.edu by 5 p.m. today.
Oh, wow, you had crimson clover over winter. My gosh. That's pretty impressive. That usually will freeze off even before the brassicas. Awesome. Do any of the research folks want to chime in on anything here?
I guess, Wade, this is Matt Helmer's. Probably the only thing I would add, I think that there's a great question about how the soil's responding to cover crops. And I think that that really is an active area of research, really quantify that. And, one of the things we start out with pretty darn good soils to begin with, but I think that, the cover crops have the potential to even improve that, but we're still kind of learning about that. Folks like Marshall McDaniel and others, I think, are doing some really good work at Iowa State, and there are others around the region doing work to try to quantify, some of the benefits of these cover crops on on soil health and just some of the metrics that you talked about.
I've got a question, Wade, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm a professor of English, so I talk too much anyway. So my question, listen to Fieldwork 2 days ago, the podcast, and one of the big questions there was, how do we certify that we're producing crops, grain from a regenerative farm? So, and in the future, are we going to be able to figure out how to get an incentive for our crops from regenerative farms? So what in your mind would be the data sets that we would need to be keeping? I have in mind Haney soil tests and cover crop measurements of various kinds, biomass and so on. What are the other factors that if you were setting up a program, you would include in something like that?
Whew, okay, well, talk about...
And sorry, Wade, I'm not talking about organic here. I'm talking regenerative.
Right. So this is definitely outside of my pay grade, but something I would definitely look at would be organic matter percentages.
Okay.
Because the change, total change in organic matter, because that's something we can measure, and we know it corresponds to quite a bit. Some soil tests I'd be hesitant to use, just because different labs have different numbers, which calls into question how valid that data is, especially judging across state lines.
Okay.
And management areas.
Okay.
The best people to talk to about that would probably be certifying agencies that are already doing things like different organic associations come to mind, just because they've follow rules.
Right.
Whereas something new would be, in the regenerative realm, there's so much that's open to debate and discussion that
Right.
Writing the rules would be worse than trying to write the rules for the organic certification process, I would imagine.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, well, we have contact information for Wade, so if you do want to continue asking questions, I can funnel those his way. But I want to point out that our next scheduled one officially on the books will be Thursday, May 14th, focusing on riparian forest and wildlife. So we'll be doing this virtual field day again. We're also working on more as we get those videos recorded, so please stay tuned to our blog, our social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and we'll keep you informed as to any upcoming events, including our now weekly webinar series. You can catch those Wednesdays at noon. And you can always visit our website, iowalearningfarms.org, for videos, publications, and more research on a variety of conservation topics. So thank you all for coming. Again, you'll be receiving an email. Please return that link. You'll make my coworker Hillary Pierce really happy. So, all right. Thank you all again, and have a great weekend.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Wade.
Thanks, Wade.